I want to tell you something I have never said in quite this way before, because I think the honest version of this story is more useful than the polished one. At 50 years old, I had a career, a reputation, and almost no real financial foundation beneath me. Not because I had been reckless, not because I had made catastrophic mistakes, but because I had spent 30 years doing what most people do, earning, spending, living at the level my income permitted, assuming that the accumulation would happen eventually, and discovering at 50 that eventually had arrived and the accumulation had not. The number in my accounts was not what I had told myself it would be. The trajectory I was on was not going to produce what I had imagined. And I remember sitting with that reality on a specific Tuesday evening in early spring, not with panic, but with the particular clarity that comes when you finally stop avoiding something you have been not quite looking at for a long time. That clarity was the beginning. Not a dramatic beginning, not the kind of beginning that makes for a clean story. Just a man sitting alone with a piece of paper and an honest accounting of where he actually was versus where he had been telling himself he was going. The gap between those two things was significant. And what I did with that gap over the next 5 years is what I want to share with you today. I am not going to tell you I found a secret. I am not going to tell you I discovered something that nobody else knows, or that the path was easier than it looked. What I am going to tell you is what I actually changed, how I actually thought about it, and why the changes I made at 50 produced something in 5 years that 30 years of less deliberate living had not. The first thing I changed was the question I was asking. For most of my adult life, the financial question I lived inside was, what can I afford? It shaped everything, what I bought, where I lived, how I thought about money in every dimension. It is a reasonable question. It is also a question that by its structure keeps you permanently oriented toward the boundary of what is possible rather than toward the architecture of what you want to build. At 50, I replaced it with a different question. The question became, what does my money need to do, specifically, for the next 15 years, and what has to change today for that to happen? These sound similar. They are not. The first question is about limits. The second is about design. And designing is categorically different from limiting, even when the resources available are identical. What I discovered when I started living inside the design question was something that genuinely surprised me. I did not need dramatically more income. I needed dramatically better deployment of what I already had. The money I was earning was sufficient, more than sufficient in retrospect, to produce the financial position I wanted. But it was flowing through my life in patterns that had been formed by habit and inertia, rather than by any conscious architecture. Subscriptions I had forgotten existed. Insurance policies that had not been reviewed in over a decade. A saving structure that was producing returns well below what alternatives would have offered, not because I had made a deliberate choice, but because I had made a thoughtless one years earlier and never revisited it. A spending pattern shaped around what my peer group was doing rather than around what I actually valued. When I mapped all of this honestly, every dollar in and every dollar out, and what each outgoing dollar was producing, the picture that emerged was not a picture of someone who needed more. It was a picture of someone who had been losing thousands of dollars a year to friction, inertia, and the accumulated cost of decisions made by a younger version of himself who was never updated. The second thing I changed was my relationship with time. And this one was harder than the first because it required admitting something that most people my age resist admitting. At 50, time is not neutral. Every year has a different financial weight than the year before it. And the years between 50 and 65 are among the most financially consequential a person will ever live. Not because they are the easiest, but because they are the last years in which the combination of earning capacity, compounding potential, and decision-making flexibility fully coexists. After 65, that combination begins to separate. The earning capacity typically reduces. The compounding horizon shortens. The flexibility narrows as fixed obligations accumulate. I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying it because understanding it changed how I treated every single year from 50 to 55. I stopped thinking of those years as time I had available. I started thinking of them as capital, as finite and non-renewable as any other resource, and I allocated them with the same intentionality I was learning to apply to money. What that allocation looked like in practice was simpler than it sounds. I identified 3 areas where redirecting attention and resources would produce the most leverage. The first was eliminating the high-cost friction I had mapped, the subscriptions, the underperforming savings instruments, the insurance overreach, the lifestyle expenditure that habit had made invisible. Removing that friction did not feel like sacrifice. It felt like reclaiming money that had been leaving without permission. The second was building a specific, modest, consistent investment position that I could sustain without drama or anxiety. Not an aggressive position, not a high-risk gamble, but a disciplined, low-cost, index-oriented structure that I committed to regardless of what the market was doing in any given quarter. The third was the one that surprised me most. It was the decision to treat my existing professional expertise as an asset that could generate income beyond its current form. At 50, I had knowledge that had taken 30 years to build. I had relationships that had taken 30 years to develop. I had a perspective on my field that had genuine market value, not in the form of a continued salary, but in forms I had never explored because I had never needed to. Consulting work, advisory relationships, teaching in professional contexts, writing that positioned me rather than just performed a task. None of these were new ideas. What was new was the decision to treat them as part of a deliberate financial architecture, rather than as potential supplements I might explore someday. When I began doing that, when I started deploying my existing expertise as a financial instrument, rather than just as a means of maintaining my primary employment, something changed in my financial picture that the budgeting and the investment adjustments alone could not have produced. By 53, the compound effect of all 3 changes was visible in a way it had not been at 51. Not spectacularly visible, not in a way that would make for an impressive chart on a social media post, but visible in the quiet, arithmetic way that compound effects always show up, steadily, consistently, without the drama that tends to precede visible financial progress in popular stories about it. By 55, the position I was in was not the position I had been in 5 years earlier, and the difference was not luck, and it was not a windfall. It was the accumulated result of asking a different question, treating time differently, and deploying what I already had with more intention than I had applied to it before. What I want to be honest with you about is what this story is not. It is not a story about dramatic reversal. It is not a story about a discovery that changes everything overnight. It is a story about a Tuesday evening at 50, and the decision, made that night, to stop managing the present and start designing the future. The designing was not exciting. It was not dramatic. It was a series of ordinary decisions made differently than I had been making them, sustained over 5 years without interruption, producing results that ordinary decisions made differently always produce when they are sustained long enough. You are at some point in your 50s, or close to them, and I want to ask you something that is worth sitting with before you close this video. Not a comfortable question, a useful one. If you mapped your financial life tonight the way I mapped mine on that Tuesday, every dollar in, every dollar out, every assumption about where it's going that has never been tested against where it's actually going, what would the honest picture show you? And more importantly, what would it show you that you already know is there, but have been not quite looking at directly? You already know the answer to that. The only question is whether tonight is the night you write it down.